So, Ulcca, we have read, this is our third book that we're reading in the Fielding book study. We've read The Power Moments by the Heath brothers and Think Again by Adam Grant. We kicked it off earlier this year. We meet bi-weekly when we do these, and it's really just a chance to bring people into a conversation around, what's happened in the field of education and how do these topics that are in these books relate to kind of our work and what we're seeing change in the field. So thank you so much for coming on to this first session. You have definitely some fans at Fielding International who are just giddy to have you join. So without further ado, I'm just going to let you introduce yourself and kind of talk about how you wrote the book, where it came from, and then I just really want this to be a conversation. So everyone, please keep your cameras on. If you want to keep your mics on, feel free to do so. Because I do just want this to be a really intimate conversation. So, Ulcca, thank you so much. I just love and respect you so much, and you're a friend. So, thank you for taking the time to be on here with us.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. It's so nice to meet all of you. I do wonder if we can do a really quick whip around because I'd love to just kind of I can see your names, but I'd love to know sort of what your role is and or like a question based on like the last two books you've read and where we are right now that you're thinking about in education. And then I can sort of kick us off with a little bit of a thing. So I'm going to go to Erin because Erin, I see you next to me. And if we just want to like popcorn it, that'd be great.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Erin Grossi. I'm with Fielding International. I'm a learning designer. I guess a question I have so many questions. One question that came up from a previous, I guess, virtual event we had was kind of around the idea of how do we really center, a lot of times we design Pathfinder projects and how might we kind of call to attention what's going on, the learning that's happening in those Pathfinders to the larger school community. So that's kind of been in the back of my mind lately.
Yeah.
Yeah, but happy to meet you and see everybody here today.
Yeah, thanks. You want to pass it to someone?
Sure. I'll pass it to, let's see, I'll pass it to Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Melton. Yeah, I'm also a learning designer with Erin and Nathan at Fielding. And I am a huge fangirl of the book, and we're just really excited to talk to you. The thing that's resonating a lot with me is I've kind of watched your progression of attempting to run for the school board and then backing off and kind of reading a little bit about why. I'm also in the school board in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And the importance of that position of the school board in hiring a superintendent, and a superintendent that would be open to innovative ideas and even equipped with the ability to handle the gray of innovation, like that in between. So thinking a lot about how do you see yourself advocating for better policies and practices to put better candidates for school boards in place so that they can make that huge decision of superintendents who then go on to innovate in schools. Sorry, that's really big, but
Oh, it's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. I'll jump to Jose, who I've invited in. Jose is a colleague with me on the school board and also works at a neighboring district. So
Hi. Yeah, my name's Jose Rodriguez. I actually am a community school coordinator at a neighboring school district next to the one that we serve on the school board. And actually, I was introduced to your book, The Future of Smart, by one of my principals from a former Montessori school that I worked at. And so, she said, Jose, like, please read this. And she's the one that encouraged me to run for school board in the first place. And so now, I've just like kind of taken the reins on education and said, how do we transform our learning spaces, right? How do we serve our youth of today, right? And think about the future. And so I read your book and was really inspired by, just what I learned. And I'm like, okay, yeah, Montessori, please, like more Montessori everywhere. And so I don't know if I don't even remember what the prompt was, but just just excited to. Sorry, what was that?
Just a question or something you're thinking about.
Yeah. How do we encourage more people to really like be innovative in education, right? And not just kind of go along with the status quo, which is what Sarah and I have dealt with, in our upcoming 3 years now on the school board, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's what I got. So it was really nice meeting you too. And I'm excited to be here. And I will pass it along to Jay.
Hello, my name is Jay. I see you looking around trying to find my square.
I know. I'm like, I see you. You're yeah.
I am up here or wherever I am in your square setup. Yeah, I have been involved with the book club with Fielding for a long time now. I have no idea how many years. But I currently serve on the board of Exploration High School, along with Nathan, and I work as an administrator at an independent school in North St. Paul called Mounds Park Academy. Super excited to dig into your book, to learn from you, learn from others. And one thing that's on my mind, is always on my mind, is some of the brightest students, the ones who have the most to offer, are the ones who struggle the most. And I think it has a lot to do with the structure of our schools. And so much of the aspects of school that rewards compliance and attention and fitting into a very specific way of doing school. And so wanting to learn more about that, how do we kind of unlock that for um, our students? And so I think the title of your book really resonates in terms of, there's so many different ways that we can recognize and harness that intelligence that exists in so many different ways. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh,
Thanks.
and I'll pass it off to Sierra.
Hello, I'm Sierra Mance. I'm an architect with Fielding International. And something that I'm currently grappling with and thinking about in my own practice, but also thinking about in terms of schools, is how AI will play a role in how things change and evolve and what that might look like.
Thanks.
I will pass it to Anna.
Hello, everybody. I'm Anna McDevitt with Fielding International. I'm our Director of Strategic Growth and Impact. And Ulcca, thank you so much, and everyone, for being here today. It's great to have these conversations. I think the part that I am really interested in and resonates with me a lot is the idea of well-being and how we define that as things like technology change and our systems need to change, finding that really common thread of humanity between us and how we can leverage that to find better solutions together.
Mhm. Thanks, Anna.
And I will pass it along to Ron.
Thanks. So I'm Ron Lamar. I'm with Feingold Alexander Architects. I'm an accredited learning environment planner. I'm also an architect. I've been doing schools for 30 years, and Ulcca, your book couldn't have hit that nail on the head any harder or dead on. I work with a lot of school districts, and I have a lot of colleagues in the industry, and we're always talking about next generation schools. And then we build the same thing. And it really, is something I'm incredibly interested in, is making schools better. I do feel that the schools we build today are not rising to the level that you describe in your books. It is pigeonholing all of the education taking place. We are actually trying to build buildings now that could easily be gutted on the inside, because we just know, talk about flexibility and adaptability. We know things have got to change. You can see it in the students, you can see it in the outcomes, you can see, everybody's talk about CTE now, as if CTE never existed before, and of course it has. It's like, what are you people talking about? It's not the new great thing.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think that's where my interest lies, and I just looking to learn a lot more. So
Thank you.
I don't know who's gone yet and who hasn't gone. So,
What I'm going to suggest is everybody who hasn't gone, put your hand up, like do the hand raise kind of thing. But the other, I'll like give you my way that I've done this. You can move people's windows, boxes around. So now when I do this kind of thing, I move everybody around so I can see who's like on who's gone and who hasn't. Anyway,
okay.
Choose someone.
So I pass it along to Mitchell.
All right.
Hi, so I'm not with building. I teach and write about mindsets, and a lot of what I write about parallels what you've written about, Ulcca. Um, and I guess one of the things that I seem to keep on coming up against, and my guess is you do too, is when we talk about how kids should be engaged with learning and the Montessori style and learning by doing and everything. The reaction I always get is, wow, that's exactly what we want to do. And as soon as we get test scores up, or as soon as we get graduation rates up, that's what we're going to do. And it's just so frustrating because they're never going to get test scores up or graduate, and they're measuring the wrong things anyhow. So it's like, and I think we're all starting with this. How do we get people to understand that we have to make the change first, and then we'll get the results? We don't have to wait. We can't wait for the results, and then we'll have the luxury of being able to make a change.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. That's great. All right. You want to call Mike? Do you want to go?
Oh, Mike, you're on mute.
Thanks, Nathan. Operating out of a car office today, so challenges abound. I'm the learning design principal and a partner with Fielding International. So grateful for everyone on the call. Excited for this opportunity to learn and study alongside all of you in this amazing topic. The challenge or question that I have is about transformation at district and system scale. How do we actually help people find the incentive to take the risk of doing something different and stepping outside of the bounds of what they're used to? And how do we make it more optically transparent that this is the right thing to do at the level that actually is durable and can maintain the size and breadth of change that's necessary? I don't ever expect an answer to that question, but those are the things that I'm constantly looking for.
Okay, thank you. Julie?
Hi, everyone. I'm Julie Rotier-Lukens, and I was invited by Aaron from Fielding to join. I have not yet read your book, but I'm already incredibly intrigued. I work with the Colorado Department of Education, and I work in the special education office. I support directors across the state of Colorado, and have had a number of years working in Denver public schools. And so this level of systems change is very near and dear and a struggle I have seen in my years. And I think that building off of what Mike shared, I think, how can you take the risks when there seems to be such unpredictability of year by year, even the financial resources and what may be shifting? How do you get people to hold on and not just wait for, oh, next year will be a better year, or we can move our money around, right? So those are the things that I think about, while also just advocating for our kids with disabilities and supporting them in their growth. Thank you.
Thank you. Janet?
I am Janet Jefferson, and I am a learning designer with Fielding International. So excited to be here and talk about this book. And things that I think about often are just sort of the how on how do you implement change, and then thinking around how to implement systems level change, and then to make that sustainable over time. So it's not just tied to one person, one champion doing the work. What happens when natural turnover occurs and people leave? So I'm really excited to dive into a little bit about the context and thinking about systems and why we are where we are now, and learning from history and trying to do better.
Thank you. Erin?
Hi, I am Erin Flaherty. I'm the K-12 focus leader with Gastinger Walker in Kansas City. We have a sister firm, which is where I'm at today, up in Des Moines, Iowa. One thing I am thinking on, I volunteered last week at the NOMA conference for the design competition that the students do. And a lot of what they were talking about was how architecture could heal and unite and empower neighborhoods. And so that's just something that's been like gnawing on since seeing their amazing presentations. So
Great, thank you. Adam?
Hi, thank you for having me. I am a curriculum director at Cloverleaf Local Schools in Medina, Ohio. I've worked, or am currently working with Nathan, Aaron, and Mike as we just opened a new 6 through 12 building last year. So I guess my burning question is, we went from a very traditional setting to this beautiful $70 million facility that has flexible learning spaces and all of these areas that make learning engaging for students, but transitioning our adults and staff to view it in that way. And working with Nathan, Aaron, Mike, Kurt, all of them, they're really starting to get us to see that, but it's a little bit of a slow roll. And but we're going to get there. But that's I guess my question is, how are we going to, keep this moving forward? Our time is limited with fielding, and we really want to make sure we're getting the most out of it.
Thanks, Adam. Marlene? Or is it, I hope it's pronounced Marlene.
Yes, it is. Thanks. I'm Marlene Watson. I'm a learning designer with Fielding International. A lot of the questions I have already been asked, but as someone who works very closely with teachers and coaches teachers, I'd love to be able to empower them to make changes within their own classrooms, but of course, like everyone else has said, to how it can build throughout the entire education system. So just maybe thinking of some of those small things that they can implement and to start the change and to start the ball rolling.
Thank you. Katie Ray?
Hi, everyone. My name's Katie Ray Stolper. I was invited by Aaron to join. This is my first one of these, so thanks. I am currently working as a consultant in the philanthropy and K-12 space. But before that, I ran the enrollment department at Detroit Public Schools Community District for the last 5 years. And yeah, just really similar themes about how to scale innovation. I think our system has seen pockets of change and innovation, it feels like, but in so many ways, our system still looks so similar from years and years and years ago, and it's clear it's not working. So what are the levers that we're missing in the system to really get some of the new ways of thinking about our education system to stick and scale? Thanks.
Justin?
Hi, everybody. I am lucky enough to have been invited by Aaron also, and am just excited to be part of this. And I think based off my career, one of the things that I've been working on very recently and wondering a lot about is I feel like we already have all the answers. We already know how to do all the things, but we don't because somehow we forgot that we're the humans who figured out how to use the earth to create amazing meals, iPhones, and artificial intelligence. And so if we can do those things, we can literally do anything we want, anything we choose, yet we don't. And so to me, it's more about the consciousness of like, how do we help people see and recognize their power? And how do we help them actually move towards creating the better that they seek in their own personally owned, locally grown type of way? And so it's not about system design. It's not about top down. It's about local empowerment and realizing what actually needs to happen at that local level and not manufacturing a bunch of stuff that gets delivered like it's 1905 again.
Thanks, Justin. And then Janelle, I see you're on the phone, I think, because you're not on video. So I just want to open it up in case you want to jump in. But if not,
I know she's driving. Janelle, are you able to come off?
no worries. Yeah. Okay. All right. So thank you all. That was super helpful just to kind of get a sense of where everyone's heads are at. And, I think there are these buckets, right? That I was hearing in there, like, what does it mean to kind of get this started? Bring people in, whether it's at the state level or from a school board position or the work that you're doing. Bits and pieces in there about like, what does this actually look like? What does it mean for adults and their capacities? What does it mean for the systems and things that we're creating? What does it mean for the work that we're doing? And then what does it mean to actually kind of create systems around all of this. So I want to do a couple things. So, certainly I'll introduce myself. You're going to get to know me through the book. But as I said to Nathan, even since the book has been written, so I wrote the book, I'd been thinking about the book forever, it felt like, wrote the book during COVID. So it came out in September 2021. And of course, the world has changed enormously since that time. And so I've been thinking about and doing a lot more work in areas that aren't in the book. And so I have some slides. So I will pull up some slides just because I think the visuals might be helpful. And then what I'll do is I'll kind of walk you through a little bit of the arc of the book. And in certain places, I'll just kind of give you a little bit of a preview of what you're going to be reading about, but also just kind of give you a little bit more in parts of the book that aren't there. And then we'll have lots of time for Q&A. What I would also suggest is if I'm talking and sharing something, I may not be able to see you. So feel free to unmute and jump in and just be like, hey, can you stop or have a question here? And we'll just kind of keep it as a conversation. Does that sound okay to everyone in terms of how to make good use of the next 40 minutes?
Sounds great.
Cool. All right. You're going to have to tell me if you can see my screen. So, in the book, I talk about this approach to education as human-centered liberatory. And I feel like these days, this term human-centered is around a lot more. But when I, even 15, 18 years ago, when I started doing this work and talked about human-centered, right? The response was, well, duh, right? What else are things except human-centered? But go to September or October of 2022 and the release of ChatGPT. And I think that really we've seen it in the conversations over the last few years, this question of what does it mean to be human, I think is definitely sort of being foregrounded in a different way. And one of the ways I think about this moment, I think there's a lot of angst around AI and it's replacing human beings, et cetera. I mean, a different take on this is we know what, maybe 10% of how our brains operate, because our brains over the course of our evolution have evolved to allow us to be in the world, manipulate the world in ways that allow us as human beings to survive. And that has been about doing things in the world, making things true in the world, but in a pretty narrow way that's about our survival. And I've been thinking a lot about this moment and the advent of AI as an invitation to us actually to say, so if there are things that AI can do now that have felt like they've been the domain of human beings alone, what actually does that invite us to do in terms of living into our full humanity in ways that we may not even have had the luxury of being able to do historically because it's been about our survival? And so this question of what does it mean to live into our full humanity certainly has been a question that for 20 years has been something that I've cared about and thought a lot about. But it's become, I think, even more present to me. One thing that switched for me or changed for me in the last kind of 5 years or so, but especially in the last few. So I am a futurist by training and by disposition, right? And 20 years ago, 15 years ago, when I used to talk about the futurist side of what was in my head, people would look at me, right? Their eyes would kind of glaze over because it just felt too far removed from their daily reality. But over the last 3 or 4 years, as the world has gotten to the place that it's been in, what I've been finding is that the futurist side of my work has actually been becoming more relevant to people. And I'm going to share a couple of slides around this. So the futurist lens in me has always been, right, if we know where the world is going, what does this mean for our kids and their education? And certainly that is kind of the thrust of the book. And I think what the book has been talking about feels even more relevant now than it has before, than it did before. But let's zoom up for just a couple of seconds, right? To kind of say, where are we at this moment? I don't know if any of you have read the book, The Fourth Turning, and then the new book that came out called The Fourth Turning is Here. There are a lot of things you can say about the book. There are a lot of people who take issue with kind of some of the nuances of the book. But at the largest level, I think one of the things that's helpful about the book is that it reminds us that progress is not linear. progress is always cyclical, and we go through cycles of change. And one of the things they talk about is the kind of way in which economic, political, social, and cultural trends over the last 100 years or so kind of show 120 years show us in the US how we've gone from periods of time where we really focused on the I, the individual, up into kind of systems and ways of organizing ourselves economically, politically, socially that emphasize the we. And so you can see right at the end of the 1800s, the early 1900s, there was this like hyper individualism. Interestingly enough, this is the period of time during which some of the people I talk about, Montessori, Steiner, Waldorf, Krishnamurti, right, they were seeing the world and they were seeing things happen. And their response in education was very much in response to a society that they felt had gone out of balance. And so the fourth turning theory is that during up through the 1950s and 60s, there was this ascendancy of systems that privileged and sort of cared for and catered to the collective. And that since that time, we've sort of been on this downward slope, moving towards this period of unraveling and crisis. And if you look at how they describe the moods of the four turnings, the third turning is this period of unraveling, where institutions are eroding, there's a cynicism, this kind of doing what feels right for me and maximizing my own well-being, and a real darkening sense of the future. So if this resonates with you, as in the moment we're in, right, that would essentially be what they're describing. And then, of course, we move into the next phase, which they call the fourth turning, where there is this moment of people saying, look, we need practical solutions for things that help us in our community. There's an urgency around us to fix the outer world. And this is a period when institutions are being founded. And so where we are and where we're going, right, is kind of captured in the third and fourth turnings. And if you overlay that idea onto this model from the Berkana Institute called the two loops model, for me, it's super helpful, right? The theory is that all systems that currently exist were once new systems. And so these systems kind of emerged, they matured. During that time, you have people inside those institutions that stabilized and kept those institutions operating in the ways that they could. And they kept them going. But as with any kind of evolution, there comes a period where institutions and systems can't be stabilized anymore, and they go into this period of decline. And all along the way, there have been these people, the walkouts, the people who drop out of the system going, hey, we could do things differently. So in education, right, it's many of the schools that I talk about in the book, the schools that many of you know and work with. So people who are out there going, you know what, this is not the way to do things. We're going to go out and do our own thing. But they've been doing their own thing in silos, right, in different spaces and places. And where we are at this moment is in this period of decline where our systems and institutions, including education, can't be stabilized and they can't be revived. And this transition period's hard because we know that things are declining. There is this need to hospice and care for the individuals who are in these old systems because they're there. And we can't yet see what's coming. But to me, this moment of transition is actually a moment of possibility because it means that we are in the moment of imagining, thinking about, and hopefully coming together to start building what will be the new systems. And what that requires is connecting those people who have been doing work in silos, not just in education, but potentially in economic development, potentially in business, right? All these different areas. And so that, from a futurist lens, is where we are right now, right? And it feels very destabilizing and uncomfortable because human beings don't like to not be able to know what's coming. But to some of you who ask these questions, like how do we get people to change? How do we get our legacy systems, whether it's districts or state departments of ed or school boards? A lot of the people who are in positions of power right now have a stabilizer mindset. And it's a different kind of mindset that allows you to kind of sit inside of the ambiguity and the unknown of this moment and imagine what's possible. And so a large part of our work right now, I think, is actually bringing people together and inviting them into the conversations that allow those who used to be who are stabilizers to come together with the people who are the walkouts and young people, right, who are telling us we need to do something different, to kind of say, let's think into and imagine into what's possible at this moment and what we want the DNA of the new systems to be. So that to me is kind of this 30,000 foot level of where we are. And it's what happens when we're in this VUCA world. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this acronym, right? But volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, where things are changing really fast. There are all kinds of unknowns that we can't account for. Change is happening really rapidly. And none of these four terms are what the human brain likes. The human brain has been wired evolutionarily to want to know that tomorrow and next week and next month and next year feel pretty similar to what we're in today. And so when we're living in a VUCA world, it kind of feels as though the ground is moving under our feet. And what happens during periods like that, right, of rapid change and changing narratives, is that human beings, because we don't have the capacity to comfortably sit inside of ambiguity and rapid change, is that there becomes this kind of these narratives about who's in our in-group, who's in our out-group, what tribe do I belong to, what political party, what faction, what ideologies, right? So changes in demographics and technology lead to this anxiety, which leads to narratives about who's in our in and out group. And that leads to this kind of breaking of being fearful, othering people, high levels of anger, right? You read the news, you read social media, you operate in the world. Like, we are definitely at this moment of breaking. And what we need to be able to do is kind of collectively and individually get to a place where we're able to connect with people across lines of similarity and commonalities in our identity, even when those things aren't necessarily visible to us in the first instance. So all of this hopefully is a helpful framing for you about, like, where are we at this moment? Why does the world feel so messed up? You're not alone, you're not crazy. We are where we are. And it is hard, and it doesn't have to be, right, as depressing as it can sometimes feel. And of course, part of the reason all this is happening is because, so change, there's nothing new about change. Change has always happened, and it's always been part of human society. But historically, change has been driven by how we produce energy. And when you produce energy in particular ways, you see that there's rapid periods of change, and then things stabilize because there are physical limits to how much water you can convert into steam, or how much coal you can get out of the ground, or how much electricity you can produce at a particular time. What's changing now is that transformation and change is being driven by how we use, create, share, manipulate, apply information. And there's no physical limit to that. And a large part of that, right, is related to artificial intelligence and what that allows us to kind of create. Because we are at the point where we have artificial intelligence, and I'm using air quotes here, that is able to create new information, apply new information, and then create even more information. And so that line, you saw that green line, it just keeps going up and up and up. And that's not good for us as human beings because it doesn't give us a chance to adapt. And yet, that is going to be part of our new, right, steady state. So I want to just spend a little bit of time. Somebody mentioned AI in the sort of thing that you're grappling with. So I really think it's important for us to at least mentally understand that artificial intelligence is a really bad term for the thing that we are seeing unfolding around us, because there are different kinds of intelligence, right? And artificial intelligence makes it seem like there's this thing called intelligence and then a fake kind of intelligence. But the reality is that there was mycelial intelligence and animal intelligence and primate intelligence, human intelligence. What we now have is intelligence that has been created on non-biological substrate. It's non-carbon-based intelligence. It was a bunch of people who were like, hey, our brains are made out of neural networks. Let's recreate that and recreate what human intelligence is. But it's a different kind of intelligence. And that's helpful for the reason I'm going to talk about in just 1 minute. But like non-biological intelligence, right, is These large language models, you know it, they've been trained on the corpus of human intelligence. We know how they were designed to work. We're not exactly sure how they're working now or why they're as good as what they are. We're not sure why exactly it is that they're able to learn at the rate that they are thinking. When ChatGPT came out, you know, people thought it was going to be a decade before they got much better. That is not what's happening. The advancements in AI have been much faster than anyone predicted. When I shut off these slides, I'm curious how many of you are actually playing with AI, right? But the reality is that AIs are sort of able to do a lot more than what we thought. So my question has been like, what is our human advantage, like comparative advantage? Okay. Common sense is one of them. And common sense to me is really grounded in the fact that we are biological beings in physical bodies that exist in the real world. And in the real world, things happen that we can't quite model or predict, right? It's not as kind of linear as it is in the abstract. And so common sense is something that, that we're much better at than AIs. There are particular competencies that allow us to be what Ethan Mollick calls co-intelligent with AIs, right? So metacognition, what's the purpose of what we're trying to do? How do we think about risks, ethics, judgment, et cetera? Although there are ways in which AIs, I think, have advantages to us because in some ways, right, they're not as emotionally kind of invested as we are. And so there are ways when I talk with and collaborate with the different AIs I work with, I'm sometimes surprised. But to me, our biological bodies is one of our biggest comparative advantages. And it relates to what Annie Murphy Paul calls our extended mind, right? So we as human beings have always privileged brain-based cognition, that particular kind of cognition and knowing and doing and thinking. But there are these three other kinds of cognition called embodied cognition, situated cognition, and distributed cognition. So embodied cognition is the idea that our bodies process information, take in information, and quote unquote think. There's some fascinating studies that have been done. So the fact that we have biological bodies, that is a kind of cognition we can and should be developing. Situated cognition, so you all are working, right, on designing buildings and spaces with the assumption that our environment shapes how we think. It shapes the quality of our thinking. If I'm in one kind of environment, I think differently, right? If natural shapes, natural colors, natural lights, really different than sitting in a basement. But how our environment influences our situatedness as biological beings in the world influences how we think. And then distributed cognition, the idea that we think with other people in different ways. It's not teamwork. It is that literally our brains kind of operate and sync up with each other in ways that allow us to think differently and better when we think with other people. And at a moment when we have AIs that are able to replicate a lot of our brain-based cognitive kind of capabilities, this feels like a really important moment for us to be leaning into these other kinds of cognition. And it's different kinds of experiences that allow us to develop those other kinds of cognition. And so if we think about like, what are human skills in this VUCA world? And I'm happy to share these slides with you afterwards, but right, top of the line for me is the ability to manage ambiguity and to understand interdependence, mutuality, complexity, because that is the nature of the world that we're in right now. Things like knowing how to learn, knowing yourself, being able to discern right from wrong, real from fake, right? That kind of thing. Adaptability, empathy, collaboration, right? And these things, I'm preaching to the choir here, are not things you learn by having somebody lecture you about them. You learn to do them by being in ambiguous situations, doing complex problem solving where there might not be right answers, where you just have to kind of feel your way and be comfortable with the idea that you may like have to take a completely different turn, right? So for those of us who are advocating with our legislators, with our, you know, our representatives, with parents, with district members, I think being able to make this argument to them or this kind of like case to them that like with AI coming, the fact that we are still having conversations about whether kids are cheating, to me is like in the wrong universe of conversation. The conversation has to be if AIs are here and the wave of AI, robotics, and biotech mean that there is no going back. this is a moment when we have to be giving young people the capability to actually exist in a world and to lean into their humanity and their human capabilities in very new ways. So I'm going to pause there really quickly, just because I want to kind of, if there's like things that are coming up or things that you want to grade, I've got another kind of set of slides, but I just want to pass it on to you. Make sense? Doesn't make sense? Any clarifying questions? I'm sorry, this is like a short session, but I want to give it to you so you can like integrate it into your conversations as you're reading the book.
So just a quick thing when you were bringing up groups. So yes, groups, being in groups gives us a tremendous amount of power. But on the flip side of it, also being in groups can and very often does detract from our power because we have this urge to just go along with the group. So I was just,
Mitchell,
maybe.
Can I ask you,
Yeah.
when you talk about groups, were you talking about the in-group, out-group kind of thing, or were you thinking about the distributed cognition conversation?
Actually, probably both because
Yeah.
they interact together.
For
Okay.
sure.
So it's, but we have, it just, you brought up distributed cognition and power groups in one of the slides, and as soon as I saw it, it's like yes, but
Mhm.
there's also the flip side of that, and so I was just I'm
Yeah.
not sure where I was going with the question. It was just like it just like hit me, and I couldn't get off of it.
Yeah. And look, one thing you will see as a recurring theme in the book is it's both and with. It is important to be anchored, and we'll talk about this idea of identity in a second, but like it is important for us to individually have a strong and stable sense of our own identity, because it's when we don't that we are most susceptible, right, to creating and having our identity formed by the group. And on the other hand, I can't become an individual and can't develop my identity outside the context of a community and other people. So it's kind of a didactic experience of like, it's like two sides of the same coin. And we tend to, in the kind of Western worldview that we sit in, it's one or the other. It's I'm either me and screw everybody else, or it's like I'm entirely with everybody else and like I don't have my own, right? So, but it ends up being kind of two parts of a whole. But thanks for that.
Other burning questions right now for Ulcca?
So my biggest one is the groups when it comes to education. So fifth grade, sixth grade, seventh grade, eighth grade, students are learning at different capacities. They're learning at different speeds. They're, interested in different things. So every single public school district that I've engaged with anyway, where you start talking about how do you group these things differently? How do you loop the teachers? How do you create that real human connection, with every single student in the school?
Yep.
They just look at me like I'm upside down, and they just look. There's no time in the day. There's no resources to do this. We've got to teach the test. You've heard all the.
Yep.
So you give some examples in your book about ways that this can happen. I wonder, like, from everybody else on the call, like, do we really believe that this is possible at some point? It happens at the university level. They don't care about age, right? They don't care about whatever. If you qualify for the course, if you qualify for the interest that you're leaning towards, then they'll allow you to kind of take that course and engage. How do you see that happening in the K-12 system, or even, earlier than pre-K-12?
So Ron, I'm going to take a facilitator's privilege on that one. I think it's a great question. And I hope you all will definitely have that conversation. One is everybody else has had a chance to kind of read the book and kind of read some of the kind of, not arguments, but the sort of like stuff I provide. But I want to make sure, because that's a much longer conversation. But if it's okay, Nathan, like write that question down for you all to kind of think about as you
record it. We'll get it. Yep.
And Ron, let me, as I go through the next set of slides, let me at least give you a sense of like why I think this is an interesting moment. But one of the biggest is, look, I disagree so profoundly with so much of what is happening right now at the federal level and the state level and et cetera. However, one of the anchoring things that has been sitting there for everyone, it's No Child Left Behind, it's federal dollars tied to testing and accountability systems, et cetera. They have basically decimated the Department of Education. And while I don't think that means we don't want to have accountability and we don't want to think about the excuse, right, that, oh, we can't because we're not going to get XYZ from the federal government, is at this point far less of a barrier than it was before. And so I think there are some interesting ways in which we can be trying to persuade people to have conversations, right, around things like mixed age groupings, thinking about age bands rather than grade levels. So let me just share this slide, right? That as we think about human potential, and like a framing piece for me is Bronfenbrenner's ecological model, right? I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but it's a youth development model that if we think about the child in the center, as young people get older, so they go from early childhood into elementary, into middle school, into high school, one of the things that's happening is that they are going further and further out on this kind of graph in terms of my family is my primary identity, then it's kind of my school and my classroom. By the time you get to middle school, you're sort of branching out and saying, hey, my identity and who I am is being shaped by my peers, by other adults. By the time you get into adolescence, which of course extends through 25, you're much more broadly out in the world and looking outwards and saying, who do I want to be in this broad context of, yes, my school, yes, my town, but also the world at large. And so how do we start using this as the model for how we think about organizing schools? And to me, that has implications for how we think about the structure of schools moving from first grade, second grade, third grade, to actually saying, let's think about the age bands of our kids, right? We know that at certain periods of time, the brain is more primed in certain ways to develop, right? As a result of the kinds of experiences that we're giving them. And how are we thinking about that as age-banded cohorts to kind of say, look, a child's brain needs to develop and it doesn't happen in 9-month cycles just because that's how schools have been organized. It happens over the course of 3-4 years. And so how do we move from specific kind of academic competencies to academic skills to competencies that are about an age band? So in the book, I use this image of like a bingo board, but like how, if I know that between birth and 5 or birth and 8, kids need to develop all these kinds of competencies, how do we put those out and articulate them in ways that allow parents, kids, educators to really think about those and say, actually, it doesn't matter where it happens as long as it is happening. And that part of what's happening then is that you're allowing healthy brain growth over time in ways that we know are sort of supported by the science. I'm going to just skip a couple of slides here. Sorry, we can come back to some of these. But, a large part of what we're, and this is part 2 of the book. I get there partly in part 1, but chapters 3 and 4 are really where you dig into this. A lot of what we're talking about here, right, is not about just changing small things, because it's really about us being anchored in sets of values and assumptions that have driven the way we have organized ourselves in the West for about 400 years, that are grounded in some things that we know about the human brain, right? That the human brain has 2 ways of paying attention to the world. The first way of paying attention to the world is understanding kind of ourselves as part of a whole, connected, embodied context, whether it's kind of the world at large, ourselves inside of our social context, but it's a way of understanding the world that really encourages us to understand how we are part of something bigger. And that's the part of our brain. This is hard, and it's interesting. Since the book came out, I talk a lot about the right and left hemispheres of the brain. And there are a lot of people who unwilling to engage with the nuance that Ian McGilchrist, who I cite in the book, unwilling to engage with that, are sort of like, nope, this is not what the science says. I actually think there's more and more neuroscience that validates this idea. It's not that everything about right hemispheric attention is grounded in the right hemisphere of the brain, but it is becoming, I think, through some of the neuroscience that we're seeing, it is true that there is a way of understanding the world that is more affiliated with this kind of right hemispheric activity. The other way of understanding the world is, hey, we've got all of this information that comes in, flows of information, thousands of sensations. We can't sift through that every single time. We have to make a decision. And so there's a way in which we begin to understand the world. We kind of take things and we box them up into categories. We simplify them, we abstract them. And it's a way of understanding the world that kind of fragments things. It takes things out of context and it privileges kind of ways of understanding the world that are conceptualized. And this latter way, this kind of left hemispheric way of understanding the world is really associated with a kind of way of thinking that emerged and strengthened during the scientific revolution in Europe. And there's nothing bad about it inherently, but it does incentivize us to kind of see and understand the world in ways that limit kind of the aperture. And so you'll see this graph in the book where this Cartesian Newtonian worldview, which is this left hemispheric worldview, is juxtaposed or put in relationship to this holistic indigenous worldview. This is not a table because it's not either or, it's both and. But the thing to understand is that this Cartesian Newtonian, more left hemispheric way of understanding the world is a narrower way of understanding the world versus a holistic indigenous right hemispheric way of understanding the world that's a little bit broader. And so if we look down this left-hand side graphic, right, as we think about the systems that are birthed when we are privileging ways of being and organizing that are about efficiency, that are about effectiveness, that are about systems that tend to be top down, right? They're creating the very systems that people are pointing at now and kind of saying these aren't working for us, versus systems that are grounded in a more holistic indigenous worldview that tend to be a little bit broader in the way that they understand the world and the ways that they're organized to allow things to happen. And again, it's not either or, but it is kind of having a conversation about the relationship of things to each other. So I always like, and in the book, I use physics as an example, that Newtonian physics is actually a really important way to understand the world because it grounds our everyday existence and the way that we as embodied beings live in the world. On the other hand, we wouldn't have AI or technology or many of the things that we have if we didn't understand quantum physics and what it allows us to understand about the world at a broader level. And similarly, right, it's not that there's anything wrong with capital or money, but it's capital and money in service of what and whom. And over the last kind of 5 years as I've been talking about this, I kind of talk about this as a modern Western supremacy culture. So I know in the US, we tend to use white supremacy culture. But I think the challenge with that is that this way of understanding the world that kind of tries to simplify and flatten out the richness and complexity of what it is to be human exists in every culture and every context in the world. And in the US, race has been overlaid on this kind of graphic in unique ways, but it's actually more of this modern Western way of understanding the world that was exported to the rest of the world and has become the sort of anchoring part of a lot of the systems and institutions that currently exist. And so for me, it's a helpful way to kind of understand why we tend to see people who do horrible things to other people, regardless of their skin color, all over the world and in the US, right? And so these different worldviews birth different systems. In the book, we'll talk about, this graphic isn't there, but there's a direct line then from this worldview, this Cartesian Newtonian worldview, to conventional education versus a holistic indigenous worldview and systems to human-centered education. And so really what we're moving towards, and what I think we need to move towards, in the same way that right now we're moving as a world, that we need to move towards systems that are more holistic indigenous. This is essentially why and how we sort of think about why we need more human-centered education. You'll see these graphics in the book, so I won't spend a ton of time on them, but somebody mentioned learning differences. And I just think this is super important for us to kind of think about, that learning differences in the way that we conceptualize them emerged out of a conventional approach to education that narrows a definition of what it means to be capable and to learn and to be smart, right? And to succeed. And so when we think about a human-centered liberatory approach, really what that approach should be able to do is to be able to take a child and say, how do you learn? What is it that you need? And you don't have to be labeled as having a learning difference because the system itself is flexible enough, right? And I think that's an important part as we're seeing, right, increasing rates of children being diagnosed. I think being able to understand why it is that human-centered liberatory actually allows us to take that label off and to say, actually, neurodiversity is the norm. Differences in how we each learn and grow and what we need is the norm. And therefore, we don't have to label you, right? And this is all sort of a mindset shift. And this graphic isn't in the book. But again, for those of us who are talking with parents and stakeholders, et cetera, of course, it's not that content doesn't matter. Reading, writing, math, et cetera. Of course it matters, but we have to think about something. And so the what has been driving education when actually the how and the why needs to be driving education at this point, and that the what is the vehicle that we use to do some of that work. And then in the third part of the book, right, we're going to talk about the nature of systems that support this kind of work. So our traditional systems, our traditional districts, our traditional state systems, our accountability systems emerge to support conventional education. Ecological systems are very different in their nature, right? They have different characteristics, which we'll talk about, and we talk about in kind of chapters 5 and 6. And so what we need to be doing is kind of thinking about what levers do we get to push inside of dynamic systems like schools or classrooms that really allow us to kind of make shifts. And it starts with mindset, and that's the kind of like paradigm shift, the mental model, right? Somebody asked, what does it mean for adults and staff to be able to do this? It is a mindset shift, but I do think sometimes you can shift a mindset and sometimes you can do things differently in your body in ways that allow you to live out a mindset shift before you can conceptually get there. And so we'll talk, you'll see in chapter 6 that there are common design choices. And the reason they are powerful is that the design choices are pushing on levers for change in dynamic systems. And so to the question that somebody asked about, how do you make sure it's not just about a leader or a particular teacher? The embedding of certain design choices enables the kind of shifts to be institutionalized into a program. And the last thing I'll say is that, for me, a large part of the last few years has been really going deeply into somatic work and this question of how do we strengthen our right hemispheric capabilities, right? That to the extent that we live in a culture that is left hemispheric dominant and we're all really good at the left hemispheric skills, what are the things we know that actually allow our left hemispheres to quiet so that our right hemispheres can be more active? And there are the science behind these, like breath work, gratitude practices, somatic practices, mindfulness practices. What they do is enable our right hemisphere to kind of be more active. And in the same way that we need to regularly exercise any muscle, if we want it to develop, we need to be really intentional, right, in our work with young people, with adults, and in the system to kind of say, how do we tone down some of the left hemispheric noise so that the right hemispheric kind of capabilities can be exercised and strengthened? And the more we do that, the easier it becomes. And one thing I've been saying a lot to people, like when we think about the big changes we want to make, it can feel really overwhelming. But in dynamic systems, right, we control two things: what we do and how we react when things happen to us. And in dynamic systems, when we make different choices in our sphere of control, if we show up differently, if we change even a small thing as a teacher or as a leader or as a student, that makes different things possible in our sphere of influence, or it makes different things happen in our sphere of influence, and that changes what's possible in our sphere of concern. And at this moment in time, when the world feels like it's going crazy, I think anchoring ourselves in our sphere of control is really important. It's like, how do we show up differently in each moment, right? Without worrying too much about the line that we think is going to connect what we do right now to like the big change that we want. Because dynamic systems in that way kind of like start to evolve in ways that we can't predict. And so that's kind of a frame for the whole book, right? The book is really grounded in trying to understand that when we're stepping into this kind of transformation, you have to let go of this kind of big sense of control and you have to kind of like go into the process and surrender a little bit to when I make small shifts, things will happen. And we start with that because otherwise we can get paralyzed, particularly at a moment when we're already feeling overwhelmed, which we all are.
Ulcca, amazing as always. I wish we had more time to really dig into it, but it's the top of the hour. For everyone else, we're going to read chapters 1 and 2 will be our next session, and that'll be 2 Mondays from now. I'll send out a calendar invite for that. Any last words, Ulcca, other than just thank you so much?
Sorry this took so long. There wasn't enough time for conversation, but Nathan, as you guys move along, if we want to like set up something towards the end or in February, since I'll be there in person. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you all. And I'll send the slides. Yes.
Thank
I saw
you.
that in the chat.
Thank you. All right.
That was
Well,
great.
take care,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thanks for being here.